Hello and welcome to episode 171 of Prose. This week, experience a hunger that harrows the body and soul, and reminisce about the almost was with eyes trained toward Italia. I would love to encourage everyone to go find Prose Podcast on social media. We are at Prose Podcast across all social media platforms. Additionally, please do consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts and music. Lastly, don't forget, prosepodcast.com is our one-stop shop for all things prose. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week, we have Faim and Venezia. Enjoy. Faim, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Good God, the hunger. Terrar had long since sold himself and his talents as a spectacle. But what all those adoring fans and curious onlookers failed to realize was that he had to eat. He hurt if he did not. He was compelled to eat. Some higher power called to him and saddled him with this compulsion. He often thought of himself like the strong, strange, magnetized metals he would swallow. Those chunks of rock that scientists had explained to him had special properties because of the very earth itself, and the minerals therein and thereon caused him to be able to stick spoons and ladles, all sorts of metal objects, to his belly, once he'd consumed those magnetized rocks. And those objects clinging to these powered rocks, they would seem to cause magic from his gut. Oh, how they pleased the crowds. Like those rocks, Terrar was drawn to consumption. He would try to pull away, try to be normal, but the need always pulled him back. Subtly at first, but then with force until he was smack against it. He had to eat. First, it was mere annoyance. As a boy, he could plow through far more food than his fully grown father. When potatoes failed to sate his massive appetite, his parents tried to supply Terrar with more meat than any one man might be able to hold. However, that did not work either. In fact, it seemed to only fan the flames of his growing need. Rather quickly, his family knew that they would quite literally be eaten out of house and home and fortune should they keep Terrar at the humble abode in the countryside of Lyon with them. When the shoulder of a fully grown cow, followed by half a flank of a stag his father found wounded, could not fill Terrar one day, he began swallowing various underused implements around the home, including a piece of board here, some nails and building supplies there. By the time he was 13, though his parents did love him, he had to go. They didn't just toss him out to be fortune's fool. They ensured their little boy had some way of making it in the world. From the beginning, they encouraged their son to use his talent as a means of making his way. They synced him up with his very first show, if one could call it that. Really, it was a band of highwaymen, assorted thieves, and prostitutes whose show was not more than an elongated ruse to separate men from their coin. They did this by having Terrar get everyone excited and intrigued by eating any spare objects around the given town or area in which they were performing. The men would hoot and cavort, being fed wine the entire time by the prostitutes. By the time for the real entertainment with the ladies in their laps, the men would sloppily stumble to tents and alleyways only to be robbed of whatever they had on them. Sometimes, the prostitutes would go home with the men, in which case the haul was even greater, as the company would simply rob the house to which they were led. Thankfully, Terrar did not have to participate in the rest. His first company saw that the boy was just that, only one step up from childhood and a talent that was making them money hand over fist. So they let him sit the robberies out. Terrar drew the line after a particular drunken evening. After 2 years with the company, a man was killed after a particularly drunken evening in Toulouse. Terrar could not, and indeed would not, abide by murder. So, the young man wandered vaguely for about a month before syncing up and signing up with a traveling charlatan named reminisce, selling elixirs to better one's health. In particular, the flim-flam man, who thought of himself as more wizard than confidence man, sold tinctures to help with a bad gut. So, Flores would have Terrar swallow pieces of glass, rocks from right off the roadway, entire pears by the bushelful, even live animals. Then, rather than have Terrar and his hunger be the star, Flores would bring a tincture to save the poor boy from certain doom after he consumed all this madness. It worked every time on the small-minded people of the countryside. But it was in Paris where Terrar found his true calling. When his nation was called into La Guerre de Première Coalition, the War of the First Coalition, Terrar felt he had to stand up and fight. He wanted to be a part of the change that was to come, so he enlisted in the French Revolutionary Army. After years of taking, he was ready to give back. And give back he did. Terrar fought bravely and was a living, breathing example of revolutionary virtue. He truly believed in the cause and was willing to die for liberté, égalité, fraternité. Unfortunately, despite his prowess and ardor, Terrar could not be kept in suitable rations. The hunger continued to weigh heavily on him. The army so adored Terrar and thought of him as a necessary piece to their plans that they quadrupled his rations, but that still was not enough. Terrar would eat anything that wouldn't put his fellow soldiers out. He would not take their rations, no matter how much they begged him to. Rather, he found rotting food, fetid food. He ate from trash heaps and discarded piles, offal from butcher shops being left for the swine. He could not get enough. Eventually, he actually began to waste away. So Terrar did not leave the army so much as wake up in a hospital bed one day. The doctors there told him he had passed out and been left behind by his brothers in arms. They had left a note wishing him a speedy recovery, but then they had gone along their way to their next engagement. He did not enjoy his time at that hospital. They did not do anything to him that Terrar himself had not done as part of a show, but here he was not making money. Here he was an oddity, a freak, to be studied rather than be applauded. They had him start their experiments by eating a banquet. The medical staff said that the food he put down was enough for at least 15 citizens, but he had to roll his eyes. That was the amount of food he had eaten 10 years ago when first setting out from Lyon with the prostitutes and criminals. From there, the doctors seemed to go mad. They were fixated on his ability to swallow living animals. They started with small lizards caught by the attendants out on the lawn. They quickly graduated to young dogs and cats, snakes, and for some reason the staff's favorite, whole living eels. The sick fascination with slow death and the struggle of these animals was disgusting to Terrar, as were the acts themselves. But he still continued to lose weight, and he seemed to waste away with each passing day. He simply could not eat enough. More doctors came and assessed his mental, emotional, and spiritual state. They found that Terrar was as normal as any Frenchman of his class. So that wasn't the problem either. Medically, he seemed sound. Expert after expert, academic after academic, but no one would listen to Terrar. He knew it was the hunger and nothing more. Whether that meant he was blessed or cursed, Terrar did not know. He just knew it was. Thankfully, General Beauharnais sent men back from Terrar's original company to check in on him regularly. Once Terrar had some color back to his hue, the general ordered him back to the front. General Beauharnais had an epiphany on hearing of Terrar's talents. Terrar was put into an even more trusted role for the Revolutionary Army. He began to act as a courier for the most sensitive communications. With Terrar's affable, everyman demeanor, his skills of having become a showman who could talk to anyone about anything, and his ability to swallow whatever he wished, Terrar could consume the communications wrapped or housed in a watertight container, stroll across enemy lines and positions, and simply fish the communications out of his excrement when he passed them. The plan seemed like a stroke of genius to Terrar, and he was pleased to serve his countrymen and the general with his abilities. Unfortunately, his inability to learn the gruff tongue of the Germans and Bavarians and Prussians meant that he was quickly realized to be, if not a spy, something of value to and for the French. So he did not serve long before a close call with an executioner's block. Fortunately, even those Germanic bastards had heard of Terrar's talents, and rather than actually killing him, they only beat him severely and mocked up an execution before releasing him back to the French as a lesson to all others who might follow. He was never quite the same after the beating, despite the stroke of good luck in being allowed to keep his life. After all, what kind of life was he leading? At the end of the day, he was a freak. A celebrated freak. But a freak nonetheless. Terrar decided that even though he had hated his time at the hospital, doctors and modern experts were exactly what he needed. So, he went to the best hospital in Paris, introduced himself as the famous Terrar, eater of anything and hungriest of men, and they jubilantly accepted him into the hospital at no charge, their eagerness helping Terrar sidestep any fees that normally would be associated with such treatment. There, he endured small cuts from scalpels, inoculations, infusions of laudanum, mass amounts of tobacco regimens, gallons of wine vinegar, and far more pleasant than the rest, dozens upon dozens of soft-boiled eggs. The doctors really thought that this combination would somehow heal his strange gut and thereby curb his appetites. But it did not. If anything, all those eggs seemed to supercharge his need. Terrar would get so hungry that he thought he might go mad. So, just like his time on army rations, he would go into the streets, now under cover of darkness so as not to be caught by the hospital staff, and he resumed eating trash and offal. When they inevitably became wise to his nighttime excursions from the hospital, Terrar began to drink the excretion of his fellow patients. Blood was the most filling. but he would go for anything. The hunger eventually began to drive him truly mad. He felt himself slip away, and those around Terrar noticed his eyes becoming more and more hollow. When it was discovered that he had begun to consume the dead from the hospital's morgue, the doctors were at a loss. And then, the boy disappeared. Two-year-old Jean-Jacques Rouen was visiting his grandmother in the hospital before he disappeared without a trace. The hospital couldn't prove it, and Terrar had no memory of it, but everyone suspected the child had disappeared down the starving man's throat. He was ejected from the Parisian hospital and given to a prison-like medical experimentation ward in Versailles. There, everything continued as before, except that Terrar became sick. God had given him this curse, and then cursed him again for succumbing to it. Terrar continued to waste away, never being able to eat his fill, and then he began to waste away from an illness sent down as punishment for his loss of humanity, or at least his suspected loss of it. Terrar never did remember whether or not he'd eaten that Rouen boy. He knew he was capable of it, but he just could not recall. Thus was the madness of his hunger when at full strength. In his darkest hours in Versailles, Terrar was comforted by his time with one special doctor, one man who did not judge him for his talent turned malady. Dr. Tessier was always kind to him. His interest was chiefly medical, to be sure, but Tessier honestly treated Terrar like a patient, someone who had hope of recovering and finding a normal life. So, when Tessier asked Terrar to sign a will that stated that the good doctor would be the sole owner of Terrar's corpse upon his death, Terrar didn't think twice. It had been a very long time since someone had been so kind and so interested. At the end, Terrar was consuming just as much as he ever did, but he was expelling any nourishment he had through diarrhea shortly after consuming. So his death came all the more quickly. Tessier was there when Terrar passed, in pain and bile. Tessier was there to watch his attendants cut Terrar open, only to find nothing out of the normal with the innards, save a wider gullet and a larger stomach than most. Tessier was there to see the pus that had seemed to be packed into every millimeter of Terrar's body. It spilled out on the floor in buckets as the autopsy was performed. Tessier was there to record that Terrar had not been anything freakish or special, either one. At least not in a medical sense. Noting on the final note of the autopsy that Terrar had died from a contributing factor of tuberculosis. But hunger was the primary cause of death. Thank you for listening to La Faim, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. Please stick around for our next short story, Venezia, coming right up. Venezia, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Venice unaccompanied by Monica Ewan. Waking on the train. I thought we were attacked by light. Chrome-winged birds hatching from the lagoon. That first day the buoys were all that made the harbor bearable, pennies sewn into a hemline. Later, I learned to live in it, to walk through the alien city, a beekeeper's habit, with fierce light clinging to my head and hands, treated as gently as every other guest, each house's barbed antennae trawling for any kind of weather. Still, I sobbed in a glass box on an unswept street with the last few lira ticking like fleas off my phone card. I'm sorry, I can't stand this. Which one of us do you love? I hope you found your way to Venice, Rachel. That was always your dream, after all. Anytime things got bad, you would talk of how we'd go to Venice soon. Next spring break. Next autumn. 2 summers from now, when we could bake in the Italian sun together and let our hunger and our missteps and our misdeeds melt away in the unrelenting heat. But life has a way of getting in the way of, well, living, doesn't it? You lost your job, so I got a second. Then a third. We adopted 2 puppies from the shelter, and you did a damn good job of training the little fuzzy ones. But you can't just pick up and go when you have living things depending on your being around to care for them. You got a new job. I quit one of my 3. We moved to be nearer your work. The cost was crippling. We got farther away from family and our established friends. I lost one of the remaining 2. Our finances got tight again. I found a second and then a third job. But our increased fortunes didn't quite cover the expenses of the newer, bigger, better apartment in the newer, bigger, better city. We cut our food before we cut the food of our dogs. They were our babies. People thought we were ridiculous for that kind of sacrifice, but we didn't hesitate. Struggling and scraping was the hallmark of who we were for that entire stint. But it wasn't all bad. We would laugh and play old video games in those stolen hours between my shifts. We would take the little ones to the dog park and get discounted Dunkin' Donuts coffees. $1.89 for 2 small hot coffees, 1 cream each, and 1 medium water with ice for the pups. That was our big spending. Remember, Rachel? Our adventures were just that. They were adventures. We reveled in the fun we could have in the face of the fear of making do in a world that doesn't make such doing easy. Even so, during those walks amid our coffee sipping throughout our throwback Super Nintendo Mario Kart sessions, we had Venice. We did research on the history of the canals and how they worked. We looked over the maps and lore attached to the fabled 400 bridges. We memorized which highlights we wanted to see or touch or eat in the boroughs or the sestieri. You highlighted just how much history was there, so I would get even more excited by our future travels. You knew just how intrigued I was by the Roman Empire and the Crusades. You played Baroque composers hailing from the city. You studied and sketched Renaissance architecture, swearing that you would be able to be our own extremely well-versed tour guide. You bought us cheap little talismans featuring St. Mark, ensuring me that the small expenditure would be well worth it when we were fully embraced by the Venetians for wearing their patron saint and looking to go to St. Mark's Basilica, not for the usual touristy reasons, but to pay homage to the great man and saintly protector of their city. The seasides and canal sides called to us, even as we sat in our humble apartment that might as well have been the Doge's palace in our eyes. I wondered, from time to time, whether you wanted to go to Venice or whether you were in love with the idea of going. My thought was close to the truth, but still so far off that I couldn't have been more wrong. You did want to go to Venice. If anything, you were both in love with the idea and in love with the city that you only knew from books and television and Instagram. Your dreams could not be contained in the suffocating bounds of our life together. A weekend away on the wrong weekend with the wrong dark winds blowing through, and I came back to an empty apartment and a bleak but firm note.
Joseph, I am gone. Please don't chase me. We both know that we each need better than what we are accomplishing together. The dogs are with me. They will be taken care of. Joseph, don't come to me. This is ended. Rachel.
What is there to reminisce on beyond that? You were right, of course. We both went on to do bigger, better things with our lives. At least, when you look at our bank accounts and titles on our business cards. We both had grander adventures in even newer, even bigger, even better apartments and cities. Our lives themselves became newer, bigger, and arguably better, though I would push back on the latter. My life is sexier to the outside observer, but our times with nothing but one another, the dogs, and bright eyes were far fuller than the life I lead now. And I would venture that you would say the same, if you were being honest with yourself. It might take 3 of your beloved gin martinis, but I do think you would admit it. We've had some fleeting contact now and again, but we do not know one another. We do not know which of our desires from the old days have been met and which are still being put off until the next year and the next year and the next. There are plenty of questions I would ask given the opportunity. Why did you leave me? What was the catalyst to push you away? Does your new family treat the dogs well? Those and so many more. But the burning question in my mind, believe it or not, centers around whether or not life can be worth the living. Whether dreams can be made flesh and reality. Whether the scariest of the scary, the spookiest of the spooky is true or not. This life has no meaning. This life contains no substance. I could go on, but all the ghost stories and horror films in the world wouldn't scare me nearly as much as the prospect of a life desperately thirsting for something and never getting to quaff at least a small sip of that which was desired.
So, I hope you found your way to Venice, Rachel. That was always your dream, after all. Thank you for listening to Venezia, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. All sounds you have heard throughout this episode are from Free Music Archive and freesound.org, as well as a couple that are thrown in of my own creation. Those taken from the websites are being used under CC 01.0 public domain dedication licenses. The poem you heard at the beginning of the second short story is Venice Unaccompanied by Monica Yuen. Venice Unaccompanied is copyrighted in 2003 by Monica Yuen, from Barter, published by Grey Wolf Press, St. Paul, Minnesota. All rights reserved. All right, friends, that does it for this episode of Prose. We will be back in 2 weeks' time as we march toward the end of 2022 together. And until we get to that very first December episode, please do continue to love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is always, stranger than fiction. Thank you all so much for listening.